What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can follow the podcast at Pack a Day Podcast. We are coming off an incredibly exhilarating walkthrough on Sunday at the Don Hutson Center. And I'm just being facetious because it was not the most exhilarating practice of all time. It was a walkthrough. There were very few takeaways and not a ton. You're not going to get any like highlight plays, right? They're literally players going through walkthroughs, jogging at best. There was a play, I will say right off the front, where Aaron Rodgers just absolutely throws a ball to the moon and it comes down, and Juwann Winfree tracked it and had a fingertip catch, even going like quarter speed or whatever. The ball was ridiculous, and Juwann Winfree somehow coming down with it was pretty impressive too. So that's your one highlight sort of play for the day, and it's against, defense that's not really trying and just, again, going through at a snail's pace. But there's not going to be any highlights here, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't actually a decent amount of takeaways from practice. So we are going to go over all of those and get you the information that is noteworthy from a Sunday practice that for the most part wasn't that noteworthy. But let's start with the move indoors, because I think it was assumed, first of all, when it was going indoors, when the Packers announced it on Sunday, that this was weather related. And clearly it could have been. The weather in Green Bay was crappy on Sunday. It was raining. It was pouring at times. And we've heard them say in the past that they, want to keep the field in a good condition. And if it's raining and, things start getting torn up a little bit, it doesn't exactly achieve that. So I think they probably would have moved in the Don Hutson Center anyway. However, Matt LaFleur made mention of the fact that this was actually something that they had decided on Saturday, and they wanted to go through more of a walkthrough, more of a snail's pace sort of practice, more of a mental day, if you will. And that's due more to, or specifically in regards to them coming down from Friday night, Green Bay Packers family night, and having a little bit more of an intense practice. You could tell that there was a little bit of wear and tear, that players were still tired. And there's a lot of things that we've learned about Matt LaFleur over the years. And I think one of the biggest, quite frankly, is that he has shown a very big willingness to take care of his players and to be very cognizant of where they are at physically and when they need additional rest. And I think there's no perfect calculus to any of this, right? You can make a strong argument that you need to push players and get them ready for the regular season. Listen, we saw a disastrous week one a season ago. On the flip side, you can also make an argument that I know last year, and you've had some of the David Bakhtiari, injuries linger and things like that. But I think over the course of his coaching career so far, Green Bay's actually done a pretty darn good job with, getting players ready for the season and making sure that they don't go into the season with a ton of injuries. And, when you have guys like Jenkins and Bakhtiari and all the guys on the PUP list that are still recovering from a season ago, that's a little bit different, right? But what you want to really avoid is players going down in practice and getting some of those long-term injuries so that they're not ready for week one. And you got guys that are on IR or can't play just from practice and preseason games, right? So you want to avoid that as much as possible. But again, there's no perfect science to it. There's a risk reward, right? On some level, you may not be getting some of the intensity and some of the reps that guys need. On the flip side, you're saving players' bodies and making sure that you're as healthy as you can possibly be going into the season. But we have clearly seen that Matt LaFleur has put a big emphasis on keeping guys healthy and making sure that he has a pulse on the players and where they're at physically going into practices, going into preseason, going into the regular season, and so on. So this was another example of that. He did make mention of, now they have practices and they had this set up anyway, but now it seems like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday will be a little bit more intense after giving guys, they had off on Saturday completely, and then Sunday was more of a snail's pace, really small, short practice on Sunday. Now they'll ramp up for 3 days, then have a walkthrough and head off to San Francisco for that first preseason game. But that was the reasoning as to why it was indoors on Sunday. The good news is that the Packers did in fact have some players that returned from injury. And that included Keyshawn Nixon for the first time, Malik Taylor for the first time in training camp. Patrick Taylor returned, as did Randy Ramsey. And a couple things here. Keyshawn Nixon looked like, again, walkthroughs here, right? So don't take too much from it, but they put him in the team right away, the team drills, even though it's just a snail's pace walkthrough. But that was a good sign for him. Malik Taylor was in a red shirt, not because he's going to transition to quarterback, but because they want to make sure that he's not having any level of contact. I would expect that would probably continue through this week. I would not I don't know, maybe I wouldn't limit it, but it might be a little bit hard pressed for Malik Taylor to play in the preseason game, but we'll see, how this sort of progresses throughout the course of the week. Patrick Taylor was back. It sounded like he went in individual drills, and I didn't keep a close eye on it, but I did see him in portions of the team drills as well. So it seems like he had pretty much a full return. And then I think the bigger news here was with Randy Ramsey, because we learned that he had another ankle injury, which is what he dealt with all last year and was out all last year. And then, when you hear that there's another ankle injury and we learned that it was on the same foot, you're like, okay, did he re-aggravate something? Is this going to be something that is now another long-term injury? But the fact that he was back at practice on Sunday, I think, was a very good sign. And hopefully he can get back to 100% and practicing, because Green Bay has a lot of questions at that edge rusher position. And, if he has every right to earn one of those spots, right? Especially if he's healthy. I think he's a little bit behind the 8 ball with the time that he's missed and coming back from injury. But if he can get back and plays well in preseason, he has every right to one of those spots, especially with what he's able to do on special teams. So he will be a player worth monitoring in the preseason, but great to see him back at practice, even in walkthroughs on Sunday. Unfortunately, there were 3 new players that were also out of practice on Sunday. The good news is one of those was Randall Cobb, who was just resting and was not an injury issue, so just a veteran day off. The other 2, Darnell Savage, as expected, who has a hamstring injury, and then Innis Gaines also was out with a hamstring injury. Now, more good news here is the fact that Matt LaFleur made mention that Darnell Savage, and reiterated the fact that Darnell Savage is not a long-term concern. So that is great news for Green Bay. We'll see when he actually gets back practicing, if that's this week or, a little bit further into the future. But the good news is that there's no long-term injury. Cobb is just veteran rest, and we'll have to keep, kind of keep an eye on Innis Gaines and see, he really needs to get out there for every rep possible. Like I said, he's had a pretty good training camp so far, and I think he's a rosterable player. I think those safety spots are very much up for grabs. So the sooner he can get back, the better chances he will have of actually trying to push for a roster spot on the initial 53. The other maybe really good news for the day is a little bit aggressive, but at least some good news is the fact that Christian Watson and Mason Crosby were with the Rehab Group. Now, I've made mention of this in the past. There's no exact science to this always either. But usually, more often than not, what happens is you are out and maybe not practicing at all. And then you sort of go into you're usually practicing or off to the side, maybe working with a trainer a little bit, but usually they stay indoors at the Hudson Center, whereas everyone else in the rehab group goes outside and does some rehab group outside. Then once you get upgraded, you go to the rehab group, and then usually the rehab group is sort of the last step before actually returning from injury. We've seen Keyshawn Nixon with the rehab group. We've seen Malik Taylor with the rehab group, and they just returned from injury. So the hope is that maybe some of these guys that are in the rehab group, that does include guys like Kylan Hill, that does include guys like Elton Jenkins, but now includes Mason Crosby and Christian Watson, both being included in that. Hopefully that means they're getting closer to a return to the practice field and being ready to go. Don't want to get anyone's hopes up too much. It's not a perfect science. David Bakhtiari was with the rehab group very early, if memory serves, in training camp a season ago, and we see how that went. So there's no perfect science here, but more often than not, the rehab group is sort of the precursor to returning from injury. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's 2 days away. It could still be, 2 months away, but there is usually a progression there. And the fact that they're going through some of the motions and actually getting work with the rehab group is a good sign nonetheless. So it was great to see Christian Watson and Mason Crosby join that rehab group from just basically not practicing or standing to the side for the majority of practice. The full list of Packers that were not practicing at all, and that includes the guys in the rehab group, was Randall Cobb, Innis Gaines, Darnell Savage, David Bakhtiari, Osiris Mitchell, Christian Watson, Elton Jenkins, Kylan Hill, Mason Crosby, Robert Tonyan, and then Cole Schneider. And speaking of Cole Schneider, he is still in a walking boot, so that's not a great sign. It seems like that is going to be something that is probably going to keep him out for some period of time. So you hate to see that. As I've talked about in the past, you hate seeing any injuries, right? But like, man, an undrafted guy is getting probably this one shot to go out and prove themselves in the league and give themselves a chance maybe at a practice squad or maybe even, shining out and making a 53-man roster. And to have just that sort of injury at the worst possible time of your career is just gut-wrenching for those guys. So hopefully Cole Schneider can make it back sooner rather than later and still give himself a shot maybe at a practice squad spot, but hate seeing him still in a walking boot on Sunday. Some depth chart notes, Vernon Scott was still with the number ones in replace of Darnell Savage. And that's at least somewhat noteworthy, right? Because in mini camps and in OTAs, it was Sean Davis with the safeties as like the number 3 guy. He got the number 3 reps at safety. And then if somebody was out, Sean Davis would be the guy that would go in and play those number 1 reps. So there does seem to be a bit of a change in the depth chart there at safety where Vernon Scott has moved up the list and it seems like Sean Davis has maybe moved down a little bit. Now, I'm saying this over and over today, but there's no perfect science here either. And what I mean by that is there are times where coaching staffs will maybe feel comfortable with what they have with a player. So for example, and I'm not saying that this is the case, maybe they don't know what they have yet in Vernon Scott, and maybe they already feel comfortable with what they have in Sean Davis. In that situation, they may elevate Vernon Scott to say like, hey, we got to get more reps. Like, let's see what he looks like with the ones. Let's see if he can make an impact in some splash plays, meaning that Vernon Scott's actually maybe the one more on the bubble than Sean Davis, because they might already feel comfortable like, well, Sean Davis is going to get a spot on our team. We don't need to see him play a ton with the ones. We need to see more of Vernon Scott. That could be the case. More likely than not, it's a legitimate depth chart change where Vernon Scott has probably jumped Sean Davis a little bit. But I think those safety spots are going to come really down to probably preseason and what the rest of training camp brings. I still think Dallin Leavitt, even though he hasn't received almost any time, a little bit of time with the ones, but not a ton. And when they break off into 2 groups, Leavitt's been down with the 2s more often. I think he has a huge opportunity to make this team based on his special teams prowess. Also, Leavitt in practice on Sunday was calling out stuff from the back end for a guy that just got picked up at the right before the start of training camp, I should say. The fact that he's already super knowledgeable in the defense and calling things out and getting guys like set up in the right spots. Look for Dallin Leavitt to have a really good chance, I think, to make this team, especially in special teams prowess. But those rest of those special team spots, whether that's Vernon Scott, Innis Gaines, Tariq Carpenter, Sean Davis, I think those conversations are probably going to come down to preseason. But good for Vernon Scott that he is getting those number 1 reps alongside Adrian Amos right now. Certainly for a young player, that is still going to help and hopefully give him some confidence. He's a talented guy. I still think he potentially could fit more as like a box safety, sort of what like Raven Green did in the past. I still think that might be the best use of him, but we'll see if he can sort of hang at safety and maybe play a part with this defense this upcoming season. Other depth chart notes on the field goal block team, we had Rico Gafford and Shamar Jean-Charles as the 2 on the edge that are rushing off the edge trying to block field goals. It was walkthrough, so they're not exactly doing it, but I do love the idea, and I've talked about this in the past, of Rico Gafford being one of those guys off the edge. And the more you can do, the more opportunity that you have to help the team, the better chance you have to make the roster. I think that number 6 corner spot is completely up for grabs. I think Keandre Thomas maybe could get in that conversation. Rico Gafford, maybe a KB Ento. I think those are probably the guys that could also claim somebody at the end. Remember last year, they make the trade for Isaac Yiadom and he comes in, so you never quite know. But I do think 5 of those spots are probably taking your 3 starters who you know already. And then I think Keyshawn Nixon and Shamar Jean-Charles are probably the 5 that seem to be a little bit more leaning in the locks direction. We'll see. I mean, Shamar and Keyshawn I don't think are there yet, but they're definitely trending in the right direction. That number 6 corner spot, I think definitely up for grabs, but I think the more that you can do, the better. And I love the idea of Rico Gafford coming off the edge. Legit like 4.2 40 speed. He is legit fast. There are fast players and then there are freaking fast players. Rico Gafford is a freaking fast guy. And I think his ability, listen, if anyone could potentially block a kick coming off the edge, get a fingertip on it, disrupt it, or maybe just, have the kicker be a little bit more pressured, I think it can be Rico Gafford with his ridiculous speed coming off the edge. So I like that. I don't know if it was a change. It's possible he'd been there in the past and I just didn't notice it. But I like that move for Green Bay, going with Rico Gafford as one of the field goal block rush guys coming off the edge. Another depth chart note, we actually got to see some Jaire Alexander in the slot for a couple reps in some of the walkthrough team drills. And I've mentioned this all along. If you've heard me talk at all about how I think this slot is going to play out this season, I wholeheartedly believe that Rasul Douglas will be the primary slot corner and play that on early downs and just kind of in general, right? I think that's going to be his spot with Jaire and then Eric Stokes on the outside. But and the reason that is Jaire is probably their best slot corner. And I think Rasul is probably a better outside corner than he is a slot corner. But Douglas is much bigger. And I just don't think that we've talked about this, right? But that slot corner is going to have to come in and fill in the run game. He's going to have to lean into things with his shoulders. And like, you're going to have to be a very physical player. Think Charles Woodson, what he did in the slot, even Shannon Sullivan, who, for his coverage inabilities at times, he was pretty darn good against the run, or at least was physical enough to come in and set the edge when he needed to. He could blitz, like he could do those things because he had the size to do it. With Jaire, I just don't think when you sign a guy to the highest paid, corner contract of all times, and he's a smaller guy, that you want him ramming into tight ends and fullbacks. Like, that's not a great use of Jaire Alexander and his body full time, right? Can you do it on a couple occasions here and there? Sure, but that's not his best skill set, and that's certainly not what you want to, put your, millions upon millions of dollars cornerback doing time after time after time. You're just going to probably limit his career at some point, right? So that's not what you want him doing. But when it comes to obvious passing downs, I do think we will see Jaire more in the slot from time to time. And I do think when you get matchups like, say, against Justin Jefferson in week 1, and Jefferson keeps lining up in the slot, I think if that's the case, I think you're going to want to move Jaire Alexander up against him in the slot, especially in some of those obvious passing situations. So clearly, I believe wholeheartedly that we will see Jaire Alexander in the slot this season. I just don't think it's going to be as a primary 50-60 snap a guy where he's lining up there and doing all the dirty work that it takes from a slot corner to do that sort of stuff. So, but we did get some look at that even in walkthrough. So it does show that Green Bay at least has some interest in playing him there this upcoming season. And I would be shocked if we didn't see Jaire in the slot in some capacity. Just don't think it makes sense to do it, a ton and sort of wear down one of your best, most highest paid players. Punt returners, with no Randall Cobb, the 3 remaining punt returners for the day were Romeo Doubs, Amari Rodgers, and Ishmael Hyman. So those were your 3 catching punts, with Doubs and Rodgers getting the majority of the work. The other note from practice, and I don't know what to make of this yet, and probably nothing until we actually see it in games. And I've mentioned this a little bit in the past as well, but man, the special teams coaching has been so incredible to watch. They are so pointed in exactly what they're doing. There is a purpose to everything they're doing. The way they're even aligning their coaches. They got a coach on one side with the jammer and the gunner, a coach on the other side with the jammer and the gunner. They got Bisaccia in the center. They got another special teams or another coach that's in the backfield. Like, they've got eyes on everything. There is a purpose to everything. They are so attention to detail oriented. It has been a totally different special teams practice this season. And I know, I think there's been a lot of buzz out there about maybe some of the intensity and how, what Rich Bisaccia, brings to the table and those sort of things. But I just really wanted to point out, like, the attention to detail and all of the coaching that's going into this. It is a night and day difference from special teams in the past. How that affects the on-field play remains to be seen. I think there's major question marks. When can Mason Crosby get back? I think Pat O'Donnell still has question marks to answer based on his performance as a punter in his career so far. I don't know that they have a long snapper that's worth keeping on the roster. There's a lot that is going to go into the special teams yet, but man, oh man, if the intensity is there, the attention to detail and the focus is there, and it has been a real joy to watch these special teams coaches and coordinators, in Rich Bisaccia's case, work day in and day out and try to take this beleaguered unit that was arguably one of the worst of all times a season ago and try to make them into something that can be respectable out on the field. I don't know if it's going to work, but if it doesn't, it won't be for lack of trying and lack of coaching and attention to detail and those sort of things. Like I said, it has been impressive to watch. Those guys know what they're doing, and you have to think, famous last words on my end, but you have to think that it's going to translate over into the special teams. And I've talked about this 100 times before. This isn't something that you need to go and all of a sudden be a top 15 special teams unit. If they can do that, hallelujah. But if they can even get into like the 24th, 25th best special teams, that sounds still bad because it is. But going from one of the worst special teams of all time, one that literally loses you a playoff game, to the 24th or 25th best special teams, that is a massive upgrade that you will live with this season while they hopefully continue to churn out players and make this a unit that can hopefully be a top 15, top 10 unit as time goes on under Rich Bisaccia. The only other thing I wanted to go over today, and if you're listening to me on any sort of daily basis, a lot of these names are not going to surprise you. Some of them I just went over in the rookie report edition over on the YouTube video yesterday, but I wanted to go over a few of the under the radar players that have sort of caught my eye during training camp. And this is something I really enjoy doing every year. Players in the past that have caught my eye that have gone on to make the team, like undrafted guys, have been Tim Boyle, obviously. There's been Raven Green. There's been Alex Light. There's others too. Robert Tunyon. He wasn't an undrafted guy, but he was the guy that got brought in from one of his very first practices. Was a guy I was sort of raving about. There's been multiple of these guys that, maybe didn't go on to have Tunyon's probably the best version of this, but maybe haven't gone on to have super long careers, but they did make the team out of training camp, or even in Boyle's case, 3 years in Green Bay and then is still with the Lions today. These have been players that have made it through the initial cuts and actually made, even if it's been minimal, some impact on the Packers. Some of the guys that have caught my eye this year so far as sort of under the radar guys, I'll go over one that was drafted first. That's Jonathan Ford. I've talked about him at length already in a couple different episodes, but I do think that they potentially found somebody here. I'm not saying he's going to be a star. I'm not saying he's even going to be a regular, and he's still on the roster bubble just because 6 defensive linemen is tough to keep, but I do think that they found something here in a rotational defensive lineman who can give them snaps and actually help them in the course of a game if that ever came to fruition. So he has a long way to go as a player. He is not there yet, but he is a rare dude with big size who can get into the backfield. I've been impressed for a 7th round pick what he's capable of. A long way to go on his progression, but there's enough there for me to be like, okay, I think they're going to keep him as the 6th defensive lineman, and I do think there is some upside with a player like Jonathan Ford. So he's the one drafted guy in this list. The rest are just sort of journeymen or undrafted guys. I'll start with Danny Davis, undrafted rookie wide receiver. I talked about him on the rookie report yesterday. He just does all the little things, right? So really good in and out of his routes, strong hands. He seems to consistently be in the right place at the right time, is always coming up with plays in the number 2 and number 3 drills. He's winning his routes in one-on-ones. It's just all that sort of stuff. And the reason why, I think we're probably not talking about him as they may be even in the conversation as a 53 guy, is just there's limited upside with his athletic ability, right? But at some point, you can just be a good wide receiver and find ways to get open and have good hands and catch everything thrown your way. And that's the name of the job, right? So Danny Davis is impressive. I've already said lock it in for a practice squad spot for him. Really liked what I've seen from him so far in the first 10 practices with the Packers. Another, and I've talked about this player quite a bit as well, is Sal Cannella. This is a player who I need to see more of from a blocking standpoint. I can't say good, bad, ugly, and different because I haven't seen him block too much, but I have seen him run routes, specifically in one-on-ones, and his route running is very precise, and he knows how to uncover and get open, and that is a very valuable trait as a tight end. He's got good height, size, he's got a good wingspan, and if you can get open in this league, that's 90% of the battle, right? But at tight end, especially in this offense, you have to be able to block. I'm going to be keeping an eye on that in preseason to see how he holds up in that regards. But he's been a player that has definitely caught my eye as well. Another, Ishmael Hyman. When they signed Ishmael Hyman, you just look at the upside for an Ishmael Hyman. I think he's 26 or 27 already. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. Maybe he's 25, but he's already a little bit older. You look at his CFL stats. And if you're not tearing up the CFL, what are the odds that you're going to come in and actually be good in the NFL, right? So you look at that sign, you're like, man, he's not young. He's had a cup of coffee already. He didn't tear up the CFL. He's not super big. He's not super strong. He's not super athletic. What are we doing? Why, at some point, you just got to get guys to fill the roster. I get that, but that's the highest, the best player that you can get at the last moment. But man, I'll tell you what, this guy catches everything that comes his way. He comes up with 4 or 5 catches, seemingly every practice. He's with the punt return group. He's come up on special teams in a couple different ways. I don't think there's clearly no chance that he has of making the 53-man roster, but if you told me he made the practice squad, it wouldn't totally shock me. I think his upside is still severely limited, but he has had a very nice training camp and has made the most of every single one of his opportunities. He's been a fun player to watch. Caleb Jones, I talked about a bit yesterday as well, but mammoth human being that if he gets his hands on you, you are not going anywhere. Some of the, limitations from a foot speed standpoint probably limit his upside long term. But as far as like undrafted offensive linemen, like there is far worse that you can do than Caleb Jones. I've been impressed with his overall movement ability, and his strength and his physicality at the point of attack is evident. That is a 6'9", 370-pound guy that if you're an edge rusher, especially in today's day and age where like these are, more like 250-pound guys, like you're in a heavyweight fight with Caleb Jones when you get to that point. He's been a player that has been fun to watch as well. The two running backs, Tyler Goodson and BJ Baylor, I've talked about quite a bit in the past, but these two have a little bit of two diverging games, right? So like Tyler Goodson is going to be your speed guy, one cut, get uphill, great hands out of the backfield. BJ Baylor going to be a little bit more of a guy who runs behind his pads, great in pass protection, and can also catch the ball a little bit out of the backfield. Two different types of backs, but both have their values, both have their intrigue. We'll see what Patrick Taylor can do coming back from injury, and if they want to keep the third running back, or if they want to maybe just elevate guys from the practice squad to be the number 3. Either way, I think both of those guys are in the conversation for that number 3 running back spot. I talked about Jonathan Ford, but the other defensive lineman who should also be very much in the conversation for a practice squad spot at worst is Jack Heflin. I think he's still very much in the conversation with Jonathan Ford if they keep 6 defensive linemen. I wouldn't write Jack Heflin off just yet. He seems to be in a little bit quicker, I'll say. This is not a guy that's going to move fast in general. He is there as a guy that you're not going to move in the run game. Very limited upside as a pass rusher, but he seems to be a little bit quicker, and he's holding up well at the point of attack in the run game as well. This is a Tyler Lancaster type of player who, you might hear that name and be like, I'm not interested or whatever. Like, if you can get a guy that can play 10 to 15 snaps per game of good run defense, and Lancaster wasn't that at times, and I understand the angst there, but if you can get a guy that is 10 to 15 snaps per game of just really solid, sound run defense that can keep some of your other guys fresh, can keep your linebackers clean, there is value in a number 6 defensive lineman that has real rotational value as a run stopper in goal line situations, on obvious rundowns, 4th and 3rd and 1s, like those sort of situations, or just even like on a 1st and 10 where you have a feeling that at least there's a decent chance they're going to run on the play. Like those are good situations to get a snap or 2 for Jack Heflin, rest your other guys, and know that he's going to hold up at the point of attack in the run game. If he can provide that, there's value there. And I think Heflin has some of that value as well. So under the radar performers that I've been impressed by so far that you can kind of keep an eye on as you're starting to watch the 3rd and 4th quarters of these preseason games and be like, what the heck should I even be watching at this point? Jordan Love's out of the game. Like, what should I be doing? Danny Davis, Sal Cannella, Ishmael Hyman, Caleb Jones, Tyler Goodson, BJ Baylor, Jack Heflin, Jonathan Ford, all names to keep an eye on as sort of back of the roster players that I've just enjoyed watching play. Don't know what it's going to amount to, whether that's practice squad. Maybe I think Jonathan Ford makes the team, or at least has a good chance at it. But who knows what it means long term. But those are the guys that I think have had under the radar really nice starts to training camp. That is going to do it for me today. Always appreciate you joining me. I will be right back here tomorrow on the YouTube video. I believe Jacob, Ross, and Jake will be back on the audio version. So make sure to check that out as well. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.